honestly don't even know why I'm bringing this up tonight. Maybe it's just the rain hitting the window pane, or maybe it's the fact that I drove past my old high school today and saw the exact spot where everything kind of fractured. You know how it is when you're trying to sleep and your brain just decides to pull up a file from a decade ago and forces you to relive it. Yeah, that's where I'm at right now. This whole thing revolves around my best friend from high school. I'm going to call her Mia. Mia was one of those girls who didn't even have to try. She was just effortlessly pretty, top of the social ladder, without stepping on anyone to get there. And we somehow ended up sharing a desk in 10th grade. We clicked instantly, bonding over shared misery of math homework and terrible cafeteria food, and we basically became inseparable. But in our class there was this guy. Let's call him Leo. Leo was the textbook definition of a rich kid with too much time and zero parental supervision. He never studied, practically lived in designer clothes, and he had this unbearable arrogance about him. And unfortunately for everyone, Leo decided that he was absolutely in love with Mia. It wasn't cute. It wasn't some romantic teen movie trope. It was suffocating. For the entirety of 10th grade, this guy just shadowed her every move. He would constantly declare his feelings, and whenever she rejected him, which was always, he would just brush it off like she was playing hard to get. What made it worse was his fragile ego. If any other guy even looked at Mia, Leo would literally gather his sketchy buddies and jump the poor kid after school. It got to the point where everyone in the district knew that Mia was off limits unless you wanted a trip to the emergency room. Before I get into the really messed up part, I need to paint a picture of where we were spending our days. Our school was split into 2 campuses. 10th graders stayed in the old, crumbling building, but once you hit 11th grade, you moved to the brand new annex right next door. Here's the thing about that new annex. It wasn't just built on an empty lot. The city had paved over an old, unmaintained graveyard to build it. And right behind the campus was this dark, sluggish canal. Whenever the monsoon season hit, that canal would flood, and the water would creep right up to the back gates, bringing this awful, stagnant smell with it. People had drowned in that canal over the years. Lots of people. Even the teachers hated the new building. They'd whisper in the faculty room about staying late to grade papers and seeing these weird, distorted shadows drifting past the frosted glass of the doors. Students who used the bathrooms on the ground floor would complain about hearing the sinks turn on full blast, water rushing down the drains, but when they pushed the stalls open, the room would be completely empty. Sometimes you'd just be walking down a silent hallway and you'd hear a slow, deliberate knock from inside a locked supply closet. But we were teenagers. We laughed it off. We thought it was just senior prank stuff or the building settling. So, 11th grade rolls around, and we get moved to the haunted annex. Leo is still in our class, and his obsession with Mia hasn't dialed down at all. It all boiled over on Mia's birthday. We were in the middle of homeroom when Leo strutted in with this massive, gaudy bouquet of flowers. The whole class started acting like a bunch of animals, hooting and clapping, chanting for Mia to just give up and date him. It was humiliating. Mia had finally reached her breaking point. She didn't just reject him, she looked at him with pure disgust, grabbed the flowers, and shoved them right back into his chest so hard they crumpled. She told him, in front of everyone, that she would rather see him dead than ever go out with him. She told him that maybe when he was in the ground, she'd consider it. It was harsh, yeah, but she was cornered. Leo just stood there, his face completely flushed. He didn't yell. He just raised his voice enough for the room to hear and told her that he'd do it, that he'd die just to make her happy, and when he did, he expected her to keep her promise and follow him. We all just nervously laughed it off. It sounded like the pathetic, dramatic whining of a rejected teenager. That night, Mia had the first dream. She told me later that she was standing on the second-floor balcony of her house, looking down at the street, and standing under the flickering streetlight was Leo. Only, his clothes were torn to shreds, and his limbs were bent at these completely unnatural, stomach-turning angles. He was drenched in blood, just staring up at her with this wide, unblinking smile. She jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, the sun already coming up. When we got to school that morning, the atmosphere was completely suffocating. Everyone was just staring at Mia as she walked down the hall. I ran up to her, practically out of breath, and frantically asked if she had heard the news. She looked exhausted and asked what I was talking about. I had to be the one to tell her that Leo was dead. Her face just drained of all color. She physically stumbled back against the lockers. The story was that around 9 o'clock the previous night, Leo had taken his dad's heavy-duty motorcycle out for a joyride with his friends. He was only 17, nowhere near experienced enough to handle a bike that size. He was speeding, trying to show off, and a massive transport truck clipped him head-on. The impact was so violent, he died before the paramedics even got him into the ambulance. The cops ruled it a tragic, reckless accident. Because he had made such a public spectacle the day before, begging Mia to date him and screaming about dying for her, the entire school was treating Mia like she was the Grim Reaper. It was entirely unfair, but kids are cruel. Later that afternoon, our homeroom teacher announced that anyone who didn't have tutoring could come with her to Leo's house to pay their respects to the family. The silence in the room was deafening. Every single pair of eyes slowly turned to look at Mia. I asked her if she wanted to skip it, but the guilt was eating her alive. She felt responsible. She told me she had to go, or she wouldn't be able to live with herself. We arrived at his house around noon. The heat was absolute garbage, just thick and heavy, and the smell of burning incense was so strong it was making my eyes water. The living room was packed with people mourning. I looked over at Mia, and she looked like a walking corpse. She was pale, shaking, and sweating profusely. I told her to just sit outside, that she didn't have to go up to the altar, but she stubbornly refused. We walked up together. Dozens of kids had already lit incense and placed it in the bronze bowl without incident. But the second Mia stepped up, her hands trembling, and pushed her sticks into the ash, the heavy wooden table holding his portrait violently lurched. It didn't just wobble, it shuddered as if someone was crouching underneath it, violently shaking the legs. The framed photo of Leo tipped over and slammed face down onto the wood with a sharp, sickening crack. Mia screamed, stumbling backward and collapsing onto the floor, completely unresponsive. The room erupted into total chaos. Adults were rushing over, grabbing rubbing alcohol and trying to fan her. I was standing there, my heart hammering in my throat, trying to rationalize it. I told the parents that she was just exhausted, that the heat got to her, and that she was emotionally overwhelmed because she and Leo were close. It was a complete lie, but I couldn't exactly tell a grieving mother that my best friend had told her son to drop dead 24 hours ago. When Mia finally came to, she was disoriented and crying, claiming that her chest suddenly felt crushed and she couldn't breathe. We all agreed to just blame it on a panic attack and left shortly after. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare. Over the next few weeks, the funeral passed, but Mia was withering away. She told me she couldn't sleep because Leo wouldn't stop visiting her. I kept telling her it was just PTSD, just her brain processing the guilt. I was trying so hard to gaslight both of us into believing it was just a psychological response. Then she told me about the bicycle dream. She said she was sitting at her dining table when she heard Leo calling her name from the front gate. In the dream, she felt completely numb, almost hypnotized. She walked outside, and Leo was just standing there with his old bicycle, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans, looking totally normal. He told her to get on, that they were going for a ride. Even though she despised him in real life, Dream Mia just silently climbed onto the back pegs. They rode through these dark, empty streets until they came across a massive crowd of people gathered under a flickering street lamp. Mia asked him why everyone was crowding around, and Leo calmly replied over his shoulder that there had been a fatal accident. Mia, feeling a pang of sympathy, suggested they go see if they could help. Leo stopped pedaling. He told her there was no point, because the guy was already dead. Mia expressed her pity, and that's when Leo slowly turned his head to look at her. She said his face was completely obliterated. It looked like someone had pressed his skull against the asphalt and dragged him for a mile. The skin on the right side of his face was peeled back, exposing raw muscle and bone, his eye completely scraped away. He looked at her with his remaining eye and told her that the dead guy was him, and he asked if she felt sorry for him now, reminding her to keep her promise. She woke up screaming, her body completely freezing cold, but she was sweating so much her sheets were soaked. She was losing her mind. She was paranoid, jumping at shadows, terrified of crowded streets. She stopped eating. Her parents thought she was just stressed from studying, and she didn't dare tell them the truth. And then came the day the dam finally broke. It was a Tuesday, I think. Mia was walking to school alone. She said the sky was unnaturally dark, heavy with these bruised purple clouds blocking out the sun. The streets were completely abandoned. No cars, no vendors, nothing. She checked her watch, and it was the correct time, but the silence was deafening. She walked into the haunted annex, her footsteps echoing way too loudly down the hallway. She pushed the door to our classroom open and stopped dead in her tracks. The classroom was full, but not with students. Dozens of people were sitting at our desks. Some were old, some were young, some were wearing tattered hospital gowns, others wearing clothes that looked decades out of style. She stood there in the doorway, her brain frantically trying to make sense of it, wondering if it was some weird parent-teacher meeting, but the math wasn't mathing. Then she heard heavy, dragging footsteps coming from the corridor behind her. She slowly turned around. It was Leo. He was standing right there, his body mangled and broken just like in her dreams. In his twisted hands, he was holding a vase. It was a funeral vase, stuffed with yellow chrysanthemums, the kind you put on a grave. But behind Leo, crowding the hallway, was a sea of horrific figures. Entities with skin as white as chalk. Figures drenched in dark, slick crimson. People missing jaws and arms. Leo stepped forward, his broken face pulling into a grotesque smile, and held out the rotting, foul-smelling flowers. "Be mine, Mia." Mia collapsed to her knees. And as she did, the people sitting at the desks inside the classroom stood up. The entities in the hallway pushed closer. They surrounded her, trapping her in the doorway. They all started laughing. It wasn't human laughter. It was this wet, gurgling sound overlapping with high-pitched weeping. They started mocking her, their voices echoing in her skull, telling her that they had granted her wish. They bragged about how they had pulled him under the truck, how they had helped him die just so she would date him, reminding her that she owed him now. The smell of the dead flowers was rotting her lungs. The voices were tearing her brain apart, and she just snapped. She let out this blood-curdling primal scream. Suddenly, she was in her own bed. It was pitch black outside. Her bedroom door burst open, and her parents rushed in, turning on the lights, frantically shaking her. She had been screaming in her sleep so loudly she woke up the entire house. She clung to her mother, violently sobbing, completely unable to form a coherent sentence for almost an hour. The next morning, she didn't show up to school. I went to her house that afternoon and her parents told me they had taken her to the psychiatric ward. The doctors diagnosed her with severe trauma-induced psychosis, claiming the stress of her classmate's death had caused a psychotic break. They gave her heavy sedatives and sent her home, but I knew better. I couldn't explain it, but the terror in her eyes wasn't a medical condition. It was a deep fucking primal fear that medicine couldn't touch. My mom, who always had a foot in the neighborhood gossip circle, heard the story and immediately panicked. She dragged an elder neighbor over to Mia's house, and they basically staged an intervention. They told Mia's parents that science wasn't going to fix a spiritual debt, and that if they didn't consult a medium immediately, their daughter was going to die. Desperate, Mia's parents agreed. They found a local medium, and what she revealed made my blood run cold. The medium explained that the new school campus was an absolute hotbed for restless, hungry spirits. When Mia screamed that curse at Leo in the classroom, those entities heard her. They feed on malice and anger. They thought it would be a hilarious game to actually fulfill the curse. They were the ones who blinded Leo on the road, dragging him under that truck. And now, Leo's confused. Angry spirit was being manipulated by them, demanding that Mia pay the price she promised. The only way to stop it was a direct negotiation. We somehow convinced Leo's grieving parents to come. We all gathered at the medium's house. The medium had brought in another woman, a vessel, to channel Leo's spirit. The room was heavy. You could barely breathe. The vessel started violently shaking, and when she finally spoke, the voice was this deep, raspy, guttural sound that didn't belong to a living person. The spirit looked around and sneered, asking if we were throwing a wedding party for him and Mia. The medium slammed her hand on the table and demanded he leave the girl alone, telling him to accept his death and move on. The vessel slammed her fists down, screaming that Mia had promised to be his if he died, and now that he was dead, he was going to take her with him. The vessel tried to lunge out of the chair, but it was like invisible hands slammed her back down. Leo's parents broke down. They fell to their knees, begging the empty air, pleading with their dead son to spare this innocent girl, apologizing for his pain, offering anything just to stop the madness. We were all crying, begging him to let it go. He fought it. He screamed that it wasn't fair, that the entities had covered his eyes on the highway, that he didn't want to die. But eventually, the combined grief of his parents and the medium's pressure forced him to a halt. He agreed not to drag Mia to the grave, but he left a condition. He stated, with absolute, icy certainty, that Mia could never belong to anyone else. If she ever dated, if she ever married, he would come back and take her life immediately. To save her life in that moment, her parents frantically agreed to the terms. The vessel collapsed, the seance ended, and the medium handed out protective talismans, looking utterly exhausted. It's been years since that day. The nightmare stopped. Leo never appeared in her room again. But sometimes I wonder if surviving was actually a victory. Mia is a ghost. She never dated. She never goes out. She goes to her office job, comes back to her empty apartment, and locks the door. I try to drag her out for coffee maybe once or twice a year, and she just sits there, looking nervously at the shadows, flinching if a motorcycle revs too loudly on the street. She kept her life, yeah, but he kept her future. And the terrifying part is, I know for an absolute fact that he's still waiting in the dark, just watching to see if she'll ever break the rules. To be completely honest with you, whenever I look back at the early 2000s, I don't feel any of that warm, fuzzy nostalgia that most people talk about. I don't think about the simple life or the quiet countryside. All I feel is a deep, nauseating knot in the pit of my stomach. I tell you this because there are certain mistakes you can make when you are young and arrogant that don't just leave a scar on your body. They fundamentally break your understanding of how the world works. They strip away that comfortable illusion that you are safe in the dark. Back then, in my rural village, there was this massive trend going around. When the sun went down, guys would grab these heavy-duty flashlights and head out into the night to catch sparrows. It sounds mundane, I know, but these birds would roost in the thick vegetation, and if you blinded them with the light, you could snatch them right off the branches. People did it to roast them, or to sell them for a few bucks to the local eateries. And I was young, broke, and incredibly greedy. I wanted that easy money. So, I rallied a group of my buddies, maybe 5 or 7 of us, and we headed down to this specific stretch of land right along the river. It was a dense mulberry grove. You have to understand the geography here. This wasn't a neatly trimmed orchard. It was a wild, overgrown nightmare of tangled branches and thick leaves that practically swallowed the moonlight. The soil near the water was always slick, always reeking of decaying roots and wet earth. We got there, and it was like hitting the jackpot. The branches were heavy with sleeping birds. We immediately split up, fanning out into the darkness, completely driven by the thrill of the catch. I was just grabbing them, shoving them into my burlap sack, moving deeper and deeper into the thicket. I didn't even care that the thorns were tearing at my clothes. A good hour must have passed in this weird, obsessive haze. My sack was practically bursting. It was heavy, and I was sweating through my shirt, feeling pretty damn proud of myself. I finally stopped, wiped the grime off my forehead, and turned around to call out to my friends so we could head back. Silence. Just the heavy, oppressive sound of the river washing against the muddy bank. I swept my flashlight around. Nothing. The grove was completely empty. It didn't make any sense. We had been right next to each other. A prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. I started trudging back toward the main path, my boots sinking into the wet mud with every step. That was when I caught a glimpse of a pale light flickering through the leaves, further down the bank. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, assuming it was just my buddies trying to mess with me, or maybe another group of bird catchers. I started walking toward the light, but as I got closer, the air seemed to grow heavier. It felt hard to breathe, like the oxygen was being sucked out of the space around me. Then, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic rustling coming from directly behind me, sounding like wet fabric swishing against the leaves, and I spun around, aiming my beam into the brush. Part of me immediately tried to rationalize it. My brain was desperately scrambling for a logical explanation. I saw a figure, dressed in something completely white, darting behind a thick cluster of mulberry bushes. I called out, asking if they were out here catching birds too, or if it was one of my idiot friends trying to pull a prank. I even tried to sound tough, demanding they show themselves. Look, back then, I didn't believe in the paranormal. I thought ghosts were just campfire stories meant to scare children. I had never encountered anything unexplainable, so my default state was annoyance, not terror. The figure kept peeking out from behind the leaves, just shifting back and forth, popping out, sliding back in. I squinted, trying to make out the details. It was definitely a woman. She had this incredibly long, dark hair that hung down in tangled sheets, but there was something deeply, profoundly wrong with the way she was moving. She was shifting out from behind the tree and then retreating, but there was absolutely no sound of footsteps, no crunching of dead leaves, no squelching of mud. I lowered the beam of my flashlight toward the ground. My stomach completely dropped out from under me. There was a solid gap of empty space between the hem of her white dress and the muddy earth. She wasn't standing, she was hovering, suspended in the air like a grotesque puppet on invisible strings, just swaying back and forth in the dark. Every single survival instinct in my body fired off at once. The rational part of my brain just short-circuited. I dropped the sack of birds and ran. I tore through that grove like a wild animal. Branches whipped across my face, tearing at my skin, but I didn't feel the pain. I kept throwing panicked glances over my shoulder, and that was the worst mistake I could have made. She was following me. But she wasn't running. She was aggressively zigzagging through the trees, darting into the foliage and instantly materializing closer, popping out from behind trunks, playing this sickening game of cat and mouse. It was like she was mocking my desperate attempt to escape. I was hyperventilating, my chest burning, just blind panic driving my legs. I wasn't looking at the ground. My foot caught hard on a raised mound of earth, and I pitched forward, tumbling down the steep embankment and plunging straight into the freezing river. I thrashed in the dark water, swallowing mouthfuls of river muck, convinced that at any second, cold, dead hands were going to grab my ankles and drag me under. The splashing must have been incredibly loud, because suddenly, flashlight beams cut through the darkness from the top of the bank. It was my friends. They scrambled down and hauled me out of the water, dragging me onto the mud, shivering and coughing up water. The moment I caught my breath, the fear morphed into furious adrenaline. I started cursing them out, demanding to know where the hell they had been and why they had abandoned me. They just looked at me with genuine confusion. They swore up and down that they had been searching the entire grove for me for the past 20 minutes. They said they had walked right through the exact spot where I had been standing, shining their lights everywhere, but they couldn't see me. It was a localized distortion. Whatever that thing was, it had literally hidden me from plain sight. It had placed a veil over me, so it could hunt me in private. Sitting there, soaked to the bone and shivering, a heavy realization washed over me. I wanted to tell them. I desperately wanted to scream about the floating woman in the white dress, but the toxic pride of a teenage boy won out. I didn't want to be the coward who hallucinated a ghost and fell into the river. So, I swallowed the terror, blamed it on tripping in the dark, and kept my mouth shut. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought if I ignored it, the nightmare would just fade away. A week bled by. It was a Saturday evening, and our entire friend group was heading out to celebrate a birthday. It was for a girl in our village. Let's call her Me. I had this massive, pathetic crush on her at the time, the kind where you would do absolutely anything just to get a few seconds of her attention. There were about 10 of us, walking in a large group toward the venue. To get there, we had to take the dirt path that skirted right past the river, right past the mulberry grove. As we approached the area, one of the guys started complaining about the walk. He suggested we just ditch the original plan, lay down some tarps right there on the riverbank, build a fire, catch some birds, and have our own private party. The moment he said that, a cold sweat broke out across my back. The memory of that pale, hovering figure hit me like a physical punch. I immediately pushed back, trying to come up with any excuse to keep moving. I argued that the birds wouldn't even be asleep yet, that we'd be sitting in the dark for hours for no reason. But then I looked at Me. Her eyes were lit up with excitement. She loved the idea of a spontaneous bonfire under the stars. She looked at me, almost pleadingly, and because I was an absolute idiot, driven by hormones and a desperate need to impress a girl, I caved. I actively suppressed my own survival instincts for a chance to look cool. We laid out the plastic sheets. We gathered deadwood and got a fire going. Someone made a run back to the village and brought back a huge crate of cheap draft beer. The night was actually going well. We were drinking, laughing, playing stupid party games. As the alcohol started to hit, the games turned into dares. Typical teenage bravado. Eventually, the attention turned to me. One of the older guys in the group pointed a beer bottle toward the edge of the grove, where the shadows were the thickest. He pointed specifically to a lumpy, overgrown mound of dirt near the water. He told everyone that the mound wasn't just dirt. It was an unmarked grave. A dumping ground for a body that had washed up years ago, someone nobody bothered to identify. He looked me dead in the eye and challenged my manhood. He dared me to walk over to that forgotten grave and relieve myself right on top of it. He said there were rumors that the restless spirit haunted the bank, and he wanted to see if I had the guts to disrespect it. Every alarm bell in my head was deafening. I knew exactly what was out there. I had seen her, but when I hesitated, I saw Me leaning her head against another guy's shoulder, watching me with a raised eyebrow. That was it. That was the trigger. I forced a laugh, stood up on shaky legs, and declared that it was a pathetic dare. I swaggered out of the firelight, stepping into the freezing darkness of the grove. I marched right up to that sunken mound of earth. I undid my pants, and as I went, I actually started talking trash. I practically yelled into the empty woods, mocking the dead. I challenged whatever was out there to show itself, bragging that I wasn't afraid of some imaginary river ghost. I finished, zipped up, and turned back toward the glow of the campfire, feeling an incredibly stupid sense of triumph. I hadn't even taken 3 steps when it happened. My vision simply dissolved. It wasn't like fainting. It was like a thick, static-filled fog rolled violently into my brain. The sounds of my friends laughing became warped and distant, and then absolute blackness. When I opened my eyes, the harsh, unforgiving light of morning was slicing through my bedroom window. I was lying in my own bed. My head was pounding with a vicious hangover, but my mind was completely blank. I had zero memory of how I got home, who carried me, or what happened after I turned away from the grave. I just assumed I had drank way past my limit and blacked out. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, when I noticed a deep, throbbing pressure in my lower abdomen. It felt like my bladder was going to rupture. I threw off the blanket and stumbled out to the back of the house, heading for the bushes to relieve myself. I pulled down my shorts, looked down, and my blood ran absolutely cold. The physical trauma is difficult to describe without sounding grotesque, but I need you to understand the reality of what this entity did to me. My anatomy was deformed. It was swollen to nearly 3 times its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shining with a sickly bruised purple and angry red hue. It looked like it was violently infected, filled with fluid, pulsating with an unnatural heat. The shock of seeing it was bad enough, but the moment I registered the sight, a wave of agonizing, blistering pain shot up my spine. It was a sharp, burning torment. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, leaning against the rough concrete wall of the house, crying, desperately trying to force out even a single drop of relief. But the swelling had completely sealed everything off. The pressure inside me was building to a critical mass. Defeated and entirely broken, I hobbled back into my room and collapsed onto the bed, curling into a fetal position, clutching myself and groaning in agony. My younger brother heard me. He walked past my room, took one look at me writhing on the bed, and immediately sprinted to the front yard to tattle to our father. He thought I was just dealing with the mother of all hangovers. My dad stormed into the room, furious. He started screaming at me, giving me the lecture of a lifetime about underage drinking and bringing shame to the house. I couldn't even form words to defend myself. I just kept whimpering, the pain overriding any sense of dignity. My dad stopped yelling. He noticed the sweat pouring down my face and the sheer terror in my eyes. He stepped closer, pulled back the blanket, and physically recoiled. He demanded to know what I had done. He was panicking, asking if I had caught some horrific disease or been burned. I could barely choke out that I just needed to go to the bathroom and couldn't. He didn't ask any more questions. He threw me onto the back of his motorbike and drove like a maniac to the nearest clinic. But the local clinic was packed with people from our village, and the sheer humiliation of my condition made me beg him to take me somewhere else. He drove us to the main district hospital. They rushed me into the emergency ward. The doctors immediately inserted a catheter. I cannot describe the profound, humiliating relief of that moment. The doctor looked at my dad with a grim expression and told him that if we had waited even 15 more minutes, my bladder would have ruptured and the internal toxicity would have killed me. But the nightmare wasn't over. Draining the fluid didn't reduce the grotesque swelling, nor did it stop the burning pain. The doctors were completely baffled. They interrogated me about reckless sexual encounters, about chemical burns, about anything that could explain the trauma. I swore to them I hadn't done anything. They admitted me for observation. Back then, you didn't get a private room. I was shoved into a massive echoing ward filled with a dozen other metal beds. The air smelled permanently of bleach and sickness. I was forced to wear this humiliating, oversized hospital gown that felt more like a dress to accommodate the swelling. My bed was situated in the absolute worst spot, right next to the main double doors of the ward, and directly beneath a large, drafty window. Night fell. The ward grew quiet, save for the sound of breathing machines and the occasional cough. My mother had taken over for my dad, setting out a thin woven mat on the cold floor right next to my bed to sleep and keep watch. Sometime well past midnight, I jolted awake. I didn't need to pee thanks to the medical equipment, but my stomach was cramping violently. I needed to use the actual toilet. The ward didn't have ensuite bathrooms. There was a communal restroom located all the way down the dimly lit hallway. I carefully swung my legs over the edge of the bed, trying not to wake my exhausted mother, and began the slow, painful shuffle out of the room. The hallway was dead silent. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating hum. I made it to the men's restroom. It was a sterile, tiled room with a row of individual stalls. The doors to all the stalls were wide open. The room was aggressively bright and completely empty. I went into the middle stall, locked the thin wooden door behind me, and sat down, wincing in pain. I hadn't been there for more than 2 minutes when the lighting fixture directly above me started to fail. It flickered violently, letting out a harsh electrical clicking and buzzing noise as it strobed 3 or 4 times before stabilizing. I tried to ignore it. It was a rundown hospital. Faulty wiring was expected. Then, I heard the sound of a toilet flushing in the stall right next to mine. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk into the bathroom. I hadn't heard a stall door close. But again, I forced my brain to find a logical excuse. I convinced myself that someone had just slipped in quietly while the lights were acting up. The overhead light flickered again. This time, it died completely, plunging the entire bathroom into total darkness. The only illumination was the faint, sickly yellow glow spilling in from the hallway under the main door. That was when the crying started. It was coming from the stall next to me. A soft, wet, miserable sobbing. My first thought was genuine sympathy. I assumed it was someone's relative, overwhelmed by the grief of a dying family member, hiding in the bathroom to break down. I sat there in the dark, giving them their privacy. But then, a realization crept up my spine like ice water. The weeping was distinctively female. I was in the men's restroom, in the middle of the night. Why was a woman weeping in the stall next to me? The moment that thought crystallized in my mind, the crying stopped, cut off instantly, as if whoever was in there knew I had figured it out. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, a new sound began, a slow, deliberate scratching noise that sounded unmistakably like jagged fingernails, digging directly into the thin partition wall, separating our stalls. And the worst part was I could hear the entity slowly climbing up the wall. Every muscle in my body locked up. I was paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like I was suffocating. I didn't want to look up. My brain was screaming at me to keep my eyes glued to the tiled floor. But the agonizing, scraping sound reached the top edge of the partition. God help me. I slowly looked up. Hanging over the top of the stall, staring directly down at me, was the woman from the river. Her hair was plastered to her face like wet seaweed. Her skin was a bloated, chalky white. But her eyes, what the fuck? There were no pupils, just two milky, dead orbs fixed entirely on me. I didn't even bother pulling up my clothes properly. I burst out of that stall, shoving the door open so hard it slammed into the wall, and I sprinted down the hallway like a madman. I scrambled back into the ward, lunged onto my metal bed, and ripped the thin blanket over my head, violently shaking. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, trapped under the fabric, sweating profusely, my heart hammering against my ribs. The logical part of my brain tried to negotiate with the terror. I told myself it was just a hallucination, a fever dream caused by the pain and the medication. I convinced myself that I was safe in a room full of people. The ward was suffocatingly hot. After about 15 minutes, I couldn't take the lack of air anymore. I slowly, trembling, lowered the blanket from my face. The room was still. Nothing was there. I let out a long, shaky exhale, but then I remembered the large window directly above my head. It was slightly ajar. I decided I needed to shut it, just to feel a barrier between me and the outside world. I carefully pushed myself up onto my knees and reached for the window latch. As my hand grabbed the metal handle, I heard a sickening, heavy flapping sound right outside the glass, sounding exactly like a huge piece of wet canvas, violently snapping and thwopping in a heavy wind, which made me slowly turn my head. She wasn't outside the window. She was floating in the air, right at the foot of my bed, hovering inches off the floor, her waterlogged dress dripping invisible water, her milky eyes boring a hole straight through my soul. I completely lost my mind. I tore my vocal cords screaming about a ghost, thrashing backward against the wall, shrieking at the top of my lungs. The entire ward erupted in chaos. Patients jolted awake. Monitors beeped. Elderly people started yelling, demanding to know what maniac was screaming in the middle of the night. I looked frantically around the room, and when my eyes snapped back to the foot of the bed, the space was empty. She was gone. I looked down at the floor. My mother was completely out cold, snoring softly on her mat. I had woken up 26 strangers, and my own mother hadn't even stirred. Humiliated and utterly terrified, I scrambled off the bed and crawled onto the floor next to her, desperately shaking her awake, begging to sleep beside her. She drowsily told me I was having a nightmare, but when she saw the sheer panic in my eyes, she let me stay. The next morning, she was so unnerved by my state that she practically dragged my father back to the hospital to take her place. The turning point happened later that day. My friends, the ones from the bonfire, came to visit me. They looked incredibly guilty. They confessed that after I had passed out near the grave, they had carried me back to the campfire. They said I had suddenly sat up, but my posture was entirely wrong. I was huddled on myself. And then, I started crying. According to them, I looked at them with an expression that wasn't my own, and sobbed, introducing myself as Tessa. I told them I had died when I was 16, 30 years ago. They realized instantly that I had brought something back with me. They said the entity speaking through my mouth begged them to let me stay at the river. She said she liked me, that she wanted to play with me. My friends had to literally beg and plead with the empty air, negotiating for my life, until whatever was inside me finally released its grip, allowing them to carry my unconscious body home. When my father, who was standing in the hospital corridor, overheard this confession, he completely lost it. He stormed in, grabbed me by the collar of my gown, and cursed my absolute stupidity. He realized immediately that the doctors couldn't fix me because this wasn't a medical issue. It was a spiritual retaliation. He marched straight home, gathered my mother, and they hired a local spiritual practitioner, someone who deals with the things that slip through the cracks of our reality. They dragged me out of the hospital, against medical advice, and brought me back to the riverbank. My entire extended family was there. Over 30 people standing around that sunken grave in the fading afternoon light. The practitioner began the ritual. He burned incense and chanted, attempting to summon the girl's spirit to negotiate terms. Suddenly, my mother, who was standing a few feet away from me, let out a blood-curdling shriek and pointed directly at the empty space beside me. She screamed that she could see the girl in the white dress standing right next to me. Before anyone could react, my mother collapsed onto the wet mud. She writhed for a second, then snapped upright. She didn't look like my mother anymore. Her eyes were wide and frantic. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms around my legs, burying her face into my knees. Then she spoke, but the voice that tore out of her throat wasn't hers. It was the voice of a lonely, desperate teenager. I remember the practitioner asking the entity through my mother why she was torturing me. My mother's face twisted into a grotesque, mocking pout. She said she did it to punish me for desecrating her only home. She explained her tragedy, how she was assaulted, murdered, and thrown into the water decades ago, her body washing up here, unidentified and forgotten. The thing wearing my mother's face whined that she just wanted me to stay down there and play with her, promising that if I came with her, she would make the pain stop and wouldn't hurt me. The practitioner tried to offer her a paper effigy, promising to burn it so she would have a companion in the afterlife, offering to help her transition and reincarnate. The entity just laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed off the river. She mocked the idea of a paper doll. She wanted flesh and blood. She wanted me. Seeing that diplomacy was failing, the practitioner resorted to force. He bound my mother's wrists and ankles with red cord, chanting aggressively, slapping a heavy, ink-stained talisman directly onto her forehead. My mother screamed in absolute agony. She convulsed on the ground, fighting the restraints, until suddenly she turned her head and locked eyes with me one last time. The voice whispered, "Don't forget me." Then, the talisman burst into sudden flame, and my mother went limp. When she woke up, she had no memory of the possession. The practitioner wiped the sweat from his brow and declared that he had banished her, and physically, the curse lifted. Over the next few days in the hospital, the swelling slowly subsided. I regained my bodily functions. I was eventually discharged, bearing only the mental scars of what I had endured. I swore I would never step foot near that riverbank again. Years went by. Life moved on. I grew up, got engaged, and tried to bury the memory of Tessa under the mundane reality of adulthood. But I know she never truly left, because the night before my wedding, I had a dream. It was so incredibly vivid that I could smell the damp earth. I was standing on the edge of the mulberry grove, and standing out in the shallow water of the river was the girl in the white dress. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked at me, gave me a slow, sad smile, and then leaned backward, sinking completely beneath the black surface of the water without a splash. The practitioner didn't banish her. He just forced her to let go of my wrist. She is still down there, in the dark water, waiting. And sometimes, when the house is completely quiet, I catch myself wondering what would happen if I ever drove past that river again. I don't know why I'm thinking about this tonight. It's been, 9 or 10 years now? Back around 2016 or 2017. I was young, naive, and completely wrapped up in my first real relationship. Looking back, it's almost funny how ordinary it all started. Just two kids trying to carve out a little bit of privacy in a city of 9 million people. We both lived in Saigon. If you've never been, it's a city that never really exhales. It's just this constant throbbing engine of motorbikes, street food smoke, and oppressive humidity. But we loved it. We were both working the standard Monday to Friday grind, treating the weekends like some kind of sacred sanctuary. Our routine was pretty standard for young couples who didn't have a place of their own. Every couple of weeks, we'd catch a movie on a Friday night, ride around the city, buy some street food, sliced mangoes with chili salt, maybe some sugarcane juice, and then we'd find a hotel to crash in. We wouldn't just book it for a few hours. We'd pay for the whole night, barricade ourselves in, and sleep straight through until checkout at noon on Saturday. It was our way of pretending we had a home together, just shutting out the world for a solid 14 hours. At the time, my boyfriend was working way out in Govap. I lived and worked closer to the center around District 3. The week this happened, his motorbike had completely broken down. It was in the shop, and of course, they couldn't get the parts until Monday. So, being the supportive girlfriend, I had been playing chauffeur for 2 days. And let me tell you, waking up at 6 in the morning to drive from District 3, pick him up, and then fight my way up Trung-Shin and Kong Hoa streets in the morning rush hour, it drains your soul. It's just this endless sea of idling engines, the smell of unburned gasoline, and the sweltering morning heat baking through your jacket. By Friday evening, I was physically and mentally exhausted. So when Friday night rolled around, I fully expected us to book a room somewhere nice and close to the city center, like we usually did. But no, he casually suggested we find a place in Govap. I was so irritated. I remember just staring at him, my muscles aching from gripping the handlebars all week, asking him why the heck we would go all the way up there. He gave me this apologetic little smile and explained that he had a mandatory overtime meeting on Saturday morning. Just 3 or 4 hours, starting at 8 a.m. His logic was that if we stayed in Govap, he could just borrow my bike, zip over to his office, finish his meeting, and come back to the hotel before the noon checkout. That way, I could just sleep in, and I wouldn't have to drive back and forth again. It made logical sense, and I was so damn tired. So I caved. We ended up driving down Nguyen Tai Son Street, just looking for a decent neon sign. We found this place that looked surprisingly upscale for the area. A tall, modern-looking building, maybe 5 or 6 stories high. It wasn't cheap either. It cost about 800,000 dong for the night, roughly $35, which was a pretty decent chunk of change for us back then for just a random Friday. We parked, walked into the bright, heavily air-conditioned lobby, and paid the guy at the front desk. He handed us a key card for a room on the 4th floor. We grabbed our bags, carrying our little plastic sacks of late-night snacks, and walked over to the elevator. It was one of those sleek, stainless steel boxes, smelled heavily of industrial lemon cleaner. My boyfriend swiped the card, and I reached out to press the button for the 4th floor. That's when I noticed it. Right below my finger, where the button for the 3rd floor should have been, there was just a hole. And I don't mean the plastic cap had popped off. I mean the entire mechanical switch had been brutally gouged out of the metal panel. You could look inside the dark little cavity and see the raw wires, roughly wrapped in thick black electrical tape, shoved back into the wall. It looked ugly, violent, almost. We both kind of stared at it for a second. I made a dumb joke about how much it would suck if we got assigned a room on the 3rd floor, wondering if we'd have to use a stick to push the wires together. He just laughed it off, assuming some drunk idiots had gotten into a fight in the elevator and smashed the panel, and the hotel was just too cheap to fix it immediately. It made perfect sense. It's a hotel. People get drunk. Things get broken. You don't immediately jump to the conclusion that something is wrong. You just rationalize it and move on. We got to our room on the 4th floor, and it was great. Crisp white sheets, a massive flat-screen TV, the air conditioning blasting. We ate our snacks, put on some random dubbed movie, and just relaxed. By the time midnight rolled around, I was practically dead to the world. I am an incredibly heavy sleeper. Once my head hits the pillow, you could drive a truck through the room and I wouldn't blink. My boyfriend, on the other hand, was the kind of guy who would wake up, if a moth bumped into the window. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe 2 a.m., he started tossing and turning. He was sighing heavily, kicking the blankets off, just radiating frustration. He kept muttering under his breath about the inconsiderate jerks downstairs. Through my sleep haze, I managed to crack one eye open and ask him what was wrong. He was sitting up, glaring at the floor. He told me that whoever had just checked into the room directly below us was being insanely loud. He described the sound of heavy furniture scraping across bare tiles, chairs being dragged, heavy, rhythmic thudding, like someone dropping textbooks on the floor over and over again. I strained my ears. I couldn't hear a damn thing, just the soft hum of the AC. I told him that it was probably just the building settling, or maybe some people having a late-night party, and suggested he just put a pillow over his head and go to sleep. It was a Friday night, after all. People come to these places to hook up, to party, to make noise. It's the nature of cheap weekend getaways. But he wouldn't let it go. The noise, whatever he was hearing, kept him up for another hour. Finally, around 3 a.m., he absolutely lost it. He snatched the hotel phone off the nightstand and furiously dialed the front desk. I lay there half asleep, listening to his side of the conversation. He was going off on the poor night clerk, demanding to know why they were letting guests move furniture in the middle of the night, threatening to demand a refund, just being a total Karen about it. And then, his voice suddenly dropped. The anger just melted out of his posture. He got very quiet, said a very meek apology, and hung up the phone. I groggily asked him why he was suddenly apologizing to the guy he was just screaming at. He looked at me in the dark. He said the clerk had sounded incredibly confused. The clerk had politely explained that there was no one in the room below us. In fact, there was no one on that entire floor. According to the receptionist, who had been working there for about 4 months, the third floor was completely closed for renovations. It had been sealed off and abandoned since before he even started the job. The hotel only booked guests on the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th floors. There was zero chance the noise was coming from the 3rd floor, because the doors were locked and the power was cut. My boyfriend sat there for a minute, trying to process it. And then his brain did what human brains do best. It built a bridge of logic over a chasm of terror. He convinced himself that the sound must be echoing down from the 5th floor, traveling through the concrete pillars in a weird way to make it sound like it was coming from below. It was a stretch, a really massive stretch, but it was better than the alternative. So we both forced our eyes shut and eventually drifted back to sleep. Morning came. The sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains felt safe and completely normal. We woke up around 7 a.m., boiled some water, and ate some instant noodles. We were chatting, laughing about his ridiculous phone call the night before, completely brushing it off in the safety of daylight. At 7:45, he grabbed his bag, kissed my forehead, and took my motorbike keys. He reminded me that he would be back by 11 a.m. sharp, told me to sleep in, and walked out the door. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, locking automatically behind him. I was alone. I turned on the TV, flipping through the channels until I found some random HBO movie. I propped myself up on the pillows, fully intending to watch it, but the sheer exhaustion of the week was catching up to me. The room was cool, the bed was soft, and within 30 minutes, my eyelids started getting unbelievably heavy. I didn't turn off the TV. I just let my eyes slide shut, letting the low murmur of the movie wash over me. I don't know how long I was asleep, but the transition from resting to something else entirely was abrupt. It started with the cold. The hotel air conditioner had been set to a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, but suddenly, the air in the room plummeted. It didn't feel like a machine blowing cold air. It felt like stepping into a meat locker. It was a damp, bone-chilling freeze that sank instantly into my skin. I shivered, instinctively trying to pull the thick duvet up to my chin, but my arm wouldn't move. It felt like someone had poured wet cement into my veins. My limbs were impossibly heavy. A massive, invisible weight was pressing down on my chest. making my breaths come out in shallow, panicked little puffs. I tried to open my eyes. The muscles in my face strained, but my eyelids felt like they were glued shut. It was as if two cold thumbs were pressing gently, but firmly, against my eyes, keeping me in the dark. My brain started to scramble. I was suffocating under the weight of my own body. I tried to tell myself it was just sleep paralysis. I've had it before. You just have to wiggle your toes, focus on your breathing, and wait for your brain to wake up your body. But then, over the faint sound of the HBO movie, I heard it. The unmistakable click of the hotel room door unlocking, the heavy hinges groaning as it swung open. My heart did a massive, painful flip in my chest. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps stepping onto the cheap carpet. In my foggy, paralyzed state, my brain immediately grabbed the most logical lifeline. It's him. He's back early from his meeting. I tried to speak, tried to mumble his name, to tell him the AC was freezing and I couldn't move. But all that came out was a dry, pathetic little rasp. The footsteps stopped right next to the bed. Suddenly, the heavy duvet was violently ripped away from my body. The freezing air hit my sweat-damp skin like a slap. A hand clamped down on my wrist. It didn't feel like my boyfriend's hand. It was freezing cold, the skin rough and dry like old parchment. It gripped me with a terrifying mechanical strength and yanked me violently upward. The force of it actually broke the paralysis. My torso jerked up, and my eyes finally snapped open, though my vision was still blurry, swimming with sleep and confusion. I looked up. There was a man standing over me. The room was dim, the curtains still drawn, but I could see he was wearing a faded plaid button-down shirt and dirty jeans. He looked vaguely normal, so my drug-addled, sleep-deprived brain still clung to the idea that it was my boyfriend. Maybe he changed clothes. Maybe the lighting was just weird. I mumbled something about him being back early, my tongue feeling thick and useless, just begging him to let me sleep. The man didn't answer. He just tightened his agonizing grip on my wrist and yanked me again, pulling me physically out of the bed. My bare feet hit the cold floor tiles. He didn't look at me. He just started walking toward the door, dragging me behind him like a rag doll. And then he spoke. But it wasn't a normal voice. It was a dry, hollow rattle in the back of his throat, just repeatedly chanting the word, to go over and over again. It sounded like a skipping record. Monotone, emotionless. I was so disoriented. The room was spinning. I stumbled after him, too weak to fight back, my brain misfiring completely. I thought, oh God, maybe we overstayed. Maybe it's past noon, and the hotel is kicking us out, and he's rushing me, so we don't get charged extra. I slurred at him to wait, stumbling over my own feet, desperately asking to let me get my shoes and clothes. He ignored me. He just kept chanting that dead, flat word, urging me to go. He dragged me out into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind us. I was in my thin silk pajamas, barefoot, shivering violently. He pulled me down the brightly lit corridor, straight to the elevator. He hit the call button. The doors slid open immediately. He dragged me inside. I leaned heavily against the stainless steel wall, my vision swimming. I watched his hand reach out toward the control panel. He didn't press the button for the lobby. He pressed his finger directly into the jagged, empty hole where the third floor button used to be, and the elevator lurched downward. It was only one floor, a 3-second ride, but the temperature in that little metal box dropped another 10 degrees. The lemon cleaner smell vanished, instantly replaced by something sickening. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open, and he dragged me out into the dark. It didn't look like the floor above us. The layout was the same, but that was it. There were no lights on in the hallway. The air was incredibly thick and heavy, smelling intensely of stagnant water, black mold, and the sharp ammonia stench of rat urine. My bare feet stepped onto the carpet, and I felt a wave of nausea. The carpet was damp. It felt slick and grimy against my soles. There were massive cobwebs hanging from the ceiling fixtures. It looked like a place that had been left to rot for decades, not months. I started to panic. The fog in my brain was clearing, burned away by the sheer wrongness of the environment. I whimpered, desperately asking where we were and where the lobby was, trying to plant my feet and pull my wrist back from whatever this was. He didn't stop. He dragged me down the pitch-black hallway, the only light coming from the open elevator doors behind us. He stopped abruptly in front of a door. I looked up. Even in the gloom, I could read the tarnished brass numbers. 303. It was the room directly underneath ours. The man let go of my wrist. He turned to face the door. Slowly, mechanically, he raised his hand and began slapping his palm flat against the rotting wood of the door, creating this sickening, rhythmic smacking sound that echoed heavily down the dead hallway. And then his head jerked toward me. For the first time, I clearly saw his face. It wasn't my boyfriend. It wasn't anyone I had ever seen before. His face was sunken in, the skin stretched tight over his skull with an unnatural, sickly gray pallor. His eyes were completely bloodshot, wild and hollow. He looked starved. He looked like the absolute worst stages of a heavy narcotic addiction. He stared right through me, his hand still rhythmically slapping the wood and his jaw unhinged in this awful, jagged motion. When he spoke, the voice didn't seem to come from his mouth. It resonated in the damp air around us, stuttering and clipping like a corrupted audio file as he punctuated every single smack of his hand against the wood by flatly repeating that he had died inside that room. My heart stopped. The world tilted on its axis. Every single hair on my body stood straight up as a wave of pure, primal ice shot up my spine. I let out this pathetic, strangled gasp and instinctively threw my hands up in front of my face, backing away. "Who the fuck are you?" I screamed, my voice finally tearing out of my throat. The second I yelled, the second I broke that horrible silence, he vanished. He didn't fade away. He didn't walk through the door. 1 second he was there, and the next there was a loud, percussive pop in the air, like a vacuum seal breaking, and he was completely gone. I was standing alone in the pitch-black, rotting hallway, wearing nothing but thin pajamas, the stench of decay filling my lungs. I have never moved so fast in my entire life. I spun around and sprinted blindly back toward the sliver of light from the elevator. I slammed my hand onto the control panel, mashing the button for the ground floor over and over again, tears streaming down my face, silently begging to whatever God was listening to just let the doors close. As the doors slid shut, my eyes locked onto the panel one last time. The button for the 3rd floor. It wasn't there. It was just the black, ragged hole with the electrical tape, exactly as it had been the night before. The doors closed, the elevator descended. I burst into the lobby like a wild animal. I had no shoes on, no bra. My hair was a tangled mess, and I was hyperventilating so hard I saw stars. There was a different receptionist at the desk, a young guy working the morning shift. He took one look at me sprinting out of the elevator, looking like a mental patient, and his eyes went wide. I scrambled to the counter, grabbing the marble edge to keep from collapsing. I begged him to let me use his phone. I dialed my boyfriend's number, my fingers shaking so badly, I messed it up twice. He finally picked up on the 3rd ring, whispering furiously because he was in the middle of his meeting. I was sobbing, completely hysterical, screaming right there in the lobby that I had seen a ghost in our room, that it had dragged me down, and demanding that he come back and get me right that second. My boyfriend tried to calm me down, telling me to just go back upstairs and wait 30 minutes until his meeting was over. I told him if he didn't come back right that second, I was walking out onto the street barefoot, and he would never see me again. I hung up on him. I slumped against the front desk, sobbing into my hands. The young receptionist, bless his heart, didn't call the cops. He actually looked terrified of me. He hurried into the back room and came out with a glass of warm milk and a slice of lime. He gently slid it across the counter toward me, speaking in this very slow, very soothing voice. It took me a few minutes to realize why. He didn't believe I saw a ghost. He thought I was having a psychotic break. He thought I was a heavy user, coming down from a bad batch of meth or acid, and he was giving me the lime to help me sober up. I pushed the lime away and wept, swearing to him that I wasn't on drugs, and frantically explaining that a man had literally dragged me down to the 3rd floor. The kid's face instantly dropped. The color completely drained out of his cheeks. He didn't say another word about drugs. He just asked me, very quietly, what room my things were in. I told him 403. I told him I would rather die than get back in that elevator. That poor kid left the front desk unmanned, took a master key, and went up to our room. He packed every single piece of our luggage, grabbed my shoes, my jacket, everything, and brought it down to the lobby. I changed clothes in the tiny, public bathroom behind the front desk. My boyfriend finally pulled up about 30 minutes later. I didn't even say a word to him. I just shoved my helmet onto my head, got on the back of the bike, and squeezed my eyes shut. We didn't even officially check out. We just left. We drove all the way back to District 3 in complete silence. We sat down at a street-side coffee shop, and I finally told him everything. The cold, the grip on my wrist, the descent to the abandoned floor. Room 303, the gaunt face. He sat there, stirring his coffee, looking absolutely sick. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. My boyfriend couldn't let it go. He started casually asking around his office, talking to coworkers who had lived in Govap for a long time. One of the older guys at his company knew exactly which hotel we were talking about. He told my boyfriend that about a year prior, that specific hotel had been front-page local news. It had been raided by the Vice Squad. It turned out the hotel wasn't just a cheap place for couples. The management had been turning a blind eye, allowing it to become a massive safe haven for heavy drug users, dealers, addicts, the worst kind of crowd. The raid didn't happen randomly. It happened because someone died. A young man, a severe addict, had overdosed on a lethal cocktail of narcotics. He died alone, convulsing on the floor of his room. Room 303. The police shut the place down for months. But the owner was well connected. He paid the right fines, greased the right palms, and eventually got permission to reopen the hotel under a slightly different name. They tried to rent out the third floor again, but the complaints started immediately. Guests waking up freezing, people reporting a gaunt man standing at the foot of their beds, staring at them, the sound of someone thrashing against the floorboards. It got so bad, so undeniable, that the owner finally gave up. He boarded up the entire third floor, cut the power, and left it to rot. But that wasn't enough. The entity down there, it was hungry. It kept trying to draw people in. So the owner did the only thing he could think of to stop innocent guests from wandering into a nightmare. He took a screwdriver and physically gouged the third floor button out of the elevator panel, destroying the wiring so the cabin could never stop there again. He tried to erase the floor from existence. He tried to break the physical connection to the room where that man died. But logic doesn't apply to the dead. The button was broken for us, the living. But for whatever was left of that addict, the elevator worked just fine. He didn't need a button to bring me down into his hell. He just needed me to be asleep, vulnerable, and right directly above him. Looking back at that morning in the coffee shop after we escaped, I remember the morning traffic roaring by, and I just lost it. I cursed him out right there on the sidewalk. I was so angry, so utterly terrified, and I just unloaded every ounce of that fear onto him. Things were never the same after that weekend. You can't really go back to holding hands and watching movies when your core memory of the relationship is tied to something so profoundly wrong. The vibe was just dead. We didn't last much longer. We drifted, fought, and eventually, we just walked away from each other. That was years ago. I have a completely different life now. I'm married, we have kids, a nice home, a safe, ordinary life, and I have never breathed a single word of this to my husband. I never will. He's a logical guy. If I told him, he'd try to find a reason for it. He'd say it was sleepwalking, a bad dream, or just the stress of the week. But logic doesn't explain the freezing, mechanical grip on my wrist, or the suffocating smell of that rotting hallway. I keep it a secret because I don't want to bring that darkness into my home. That hotel in Govap is still standing. The owner might have gouged out a piece of plastic to stop the living from going down there. But that doesn't do a damn thing to stop the dead from reaching up. That third floor belongs to him now. We were just trespassing in his hell, and the terrifying truth that I have to live with, the reason I sometimes lie awake in the dead of night while my family is fast asleep, is knowing that whatever dragged me into the dark didn't get banished. It wasn't exorcised. It's still right there in room 303, waiting for the next person to fall asleep.